So even though it was the biggest film of all time, for the last 5 years the internet has been screaming that Avatar had no cultural impact. And true, Avatar has not had the staying power of other films of its time, so I can understand the skepticism. And look, I like the first Avatar, but I think I have a lot of the same problems as a lot of people. Looks great, but not a great story. So I really wasn't excited by the prospect of a sequel, but I am excited by James Cameron. He is a director who has repeatedly done the impossible. He made a sequel to Alien and Terminator 2 that are both incredible, made the highest grossing film of all time about the bloody Titanic, and then did it again with a movie about blue people, all while pushing technology and film forward. His track record is impeccable. So when the man dedicates himself to 4 more Avatar films, and with this one coming out a full 13 years after the original, whenever you think of him, it's an eye-raising proposition. So the question really becomes, is there enough to drag audiences back? Well, this film is a technical marvel. It is just incredible to look at. Everything just feels so tangible. With so much of recent blockbuster fare, it's cool to see the things they come up with, but you can see where they've added things in post. You have to suspend your disbelief a little bit. But here, a lot of the time with the environment, it's really hard to tell where reality ends and CG begins. Like, you can see water droplets dripping off the skin of characters, and every time it cuts to a close-up of the Na'vi, it's just incredible the detail in these CG characters. This world just feels real, and Cameron makes a very conscious effort in how he's shot the film to keep it grounded. When filming like this, the camera could really be going anywhere. He could be pulling off insanely showy shots that would be impossible in the real world, but he keeps it all very naturalistic. It all feels like it's being shot on location with real cameras. Like, there's one shot where they're inside a hut and light spills in from outside, and the outside light is a couple stops overexposed. I'm sure they could have made it look perfect, but they've done it that way because that's how the light would actually look in that environment. It's a small thing, but it's all those tiny details that really add up to make everything feel real, which is amazing, but it's also really confusing because there's all this effort put into grounding you in this world, and then there's the high frame rate sequences. So if you're not aware, films are shot at 24 frames per second. There's 24 individual pictures for 1 second of film, and for a lot of this film, it's shot at 24 frames, but parts of it are shot at 48 frames, which means everything looks really smooth because there's twice the amount of frames. And it's weird because every time it went to 48 frames, I was just completely taken out of the film. There are some beautiful sequences, but the high frame rate just makes me feel like I'm watching a video game. Now, I could understand it a bit more if they reserved the high frame rate for underwater sequences or sky sequences, but just in the middle of dialogue scenes, it'll just randomly cut back and forth between the frame rates, and it is really jarring. And it's frustrating because this film works so hard to immerse you in this world, and then I'm immediately taken out of it with random high frame rate. And that's a really big problem when this film tries to set up so much. Now, the plot itself is quite simple. The bad guy from the first one is back, but this time in a Na'vi body, and he's made it his mission to kill Jake Sully. Meanwhile, Jake has formed a family with Neytiri, but now that the humans have returned, his tribe and his family are under threat. Now, if Avatar 1 was about introducing you to the world, then Avatar 2 feels like it's here to introduce you to the characters. The tricky part is there are so many of them. There's Jake and Neytiri, they have 4 children, then there's a friend called Spider, then there's a whole water tribe. There are just so many characters that for the first hour, I found it really hard to connect with any of them. It feels like a TV show in the scope of the players in this. Even at 3 hours long, there really isn't enough time to fully develop any of them. Neytiri in this film gets surprisingly little screen time, and aside from Jake, who's really coasting on the fact that I liked him in the first film, the only other character I was particularly interested in was Sigourney Weaver's. So she's playing the daughter of her character from the first Avatar film, and even though Sigourney is over 70, she's playing a 15-year-old, and it's a really impressive performance. Now, obviously the performance capture helps with that a lot, but her voice sounds so different as well. It always felt like there was much more going on with her than just what she was saying. The return of Quaritch is an interesting choice. While there are some nice ideas for his character, a lot of them didn't feel particularly well explored in this film, and his entire motivation is just to kill Jake Sully. It's a fine performance, but he's not going to be remembered as any great movie villain. The worst, though, was the character of Spider. He's this human baby who got stuck on Pandora, so he's grown up in Na'vi culture. Again, nice idea for a character, but his performance was really weak. It's quite a complicated character he's supposed to be playing. On top of the half human, half Na'vi culture, he's got a lot of emotional baggage, but the character just ends up being really annoying. This all starts under the backdrop of the now familiar Pandora, and with the same villain, the Return of the Sky People, a lot of the opening feels very much more of the same. And while the plot is still relatively thin, thankfully Cameron is a smart enough director to know he can't just offer the same thing twice, and it's when he wisely changes location where things really picked up for me. A lot of science fiction has these single biome worlds. There's a sand planet, a snow planet, but this shows a completely different side to Pandora and a completely different culture. The water people are physically different. They have different tails for swimming and are a slightly different color. It just goes a long way to add so much depth to this world by showing different sides to it. Just like how Jake had to integrate himself into the Na'vi in the first film, he has to do so again with the water tribe here, and it does feel quite familiar, but I did enjoy the familial stakes that this one has. There's a nice blend of the personal and the political as Jake needs to protect his family while also aligning himself with this tribe leader, and it's all made messier by his teenage children having their own problems while being uprooted from their home. And it's here it becomes really clear that the plan for these films is to be a generational story that will span years. The problem is that makes a lot of this film feel like setup, and so while the plot does enough, it's really the spectacle that's the driving force here. And thankfully it really delivers on that. We get a lot of underwater sequences which feel like a whole other world in itself, and you just really feel the respect for the ocean. James Cameron is a big environmental advocate, and he's spoken at length about how part of the reason he's making these films is to spread a message of caring for the environment, and I think he did a really good job at that with the Water Tribe. It never felt preachy to me, and we see different creatures, and it's weird how I became invested in them, sometimes more than the main characters. But even though this has an environmental message, this is still a film by the guy that made Aliens and Terminator 2. James Cameron is an action director, and he really delivers in that regard. And it's not just that it looks awesome and has exciting sequences, which it has, it's the fact that him and his editors are able to cut between different locations and plot threads and have all the sequences flow seamlessly. The action is so well paced, it just feels really well put together, and as the title suggests, water is a pretty big part of it. Now, between The Abyss and Titanic, it's clear that James Cameron loves water. The sinking in Titanic is one of the best sequences ever put to film, and it still stands alone because using water in that way is incredibly difficult. So it's really exciting for me to see water used in the action sequences here. There's just something so terrifying about how physically relentless it is and how these great big machines can really be brought to their knees with it. I just love how water in this film is both a really beautiful, calm thing, but then also really dangerous and intense during the action scenes. And the third act action works so well because this isn't a big climactic end of the world fight. It's really quite a relatively small skirmish in the grand scheme of things, but the personal stakes are really high. And it's here you see the advantage of having so many characters, because I was sitting watching it thinking, this film really could afford to kill some people, which really added to the stakes. I just wish I cared about the characters more to really be invested in it. And so by the end of this film, I was left confused. The spectacle of this movie is cinema unlike anything you've seen this year. There are few filmmakers alive who would be allowed to make this film, and in that respect, this film and the sequels it promised are very exciting, especially because of how restrained this film feels. It adds a lot of players to the board, and that means where it really succeeds where the first one didn't is justify another 3 films and entice me to see them, but I'm really gonna need more of a story. I wanted to love this film on its own, and on rewatch I might. I think there's a lot of this film that works better in retrospect than it did during my first viewing, but it will really be fascinating to see how this film plays in 6 years from now in the context of the whole series. It's films like this that show how silly rating things are, because it's hard to give a number to such a mixed bag, but for now I'd give this a decent 7. Thanks for watching. For more film stuff, subscribe.